So hi everyone, we're going to start to talk about section 1.3, and we're going to begin with the idea of experimental design and designing a statistical study. And what I'd like to do is at the end of this, I'd like for us to create a class-wide experiment based on some of these things here, and then figure out a way and then actually carry it out. So hopefully we can do that next week. We'll do a couple of lectures here and hopefully finish all the vocab, and then let's see how far we can go, and maybe we'll come back and then check our experiment out later and see what we can figure out. So what happens when you design a statistical study? Well, according to our textbook, there are basically 6 things that you need to pay attention to. And before I discuss these 6 things, the one thing I want to say to you is that every statistical study has a goal of just collecting some data over something that someone or some organization is interested in, and then making a decision based on that data. And so the study we're going to design as a class, it could be trivial in the sense that it's not going to be earth-shaking, but what we would like to do is design some sort of study and figure some things out through going through these steps, and based on these steps then we want to have a result, some kind of conclusion. You know, that Coke is better than Pepsi or something like that. So you start thinking about it a little bit, especially as you read the chapter and listen to the video, and as we talk through these things, and then maybe we can come up with a good plan. So what are the 6 guidelines when we design a study? Well, number 1, we need to know what our variables and what our population is. So what do we want to study about, and who or what are we going to study to get that information from? So for instance, the Coke and Pepsi, we want to find out if the population of people in the US prefer Coke or Pepsi, and the variables are basically which one tastes best. Alright, and so that's kind of the focus of a study like that. Alright, then you need a plan to do that. Well, part of the problem is I cannot taste test Coke and Pepsi with everybody in the US. So I might have to figure out, how am I going to get a sample, you know, what's a good way to do that, how am I going to set up what I'm doing so that I can actually taste test Coke and Pepsi and it's actually different. So and just mention those things. That's what you want to think about. Planning is probably, I think, the most important step. If you plan well, everything else falls into place. Then you actually collect the data, you'll perform your study, whether you're observing things or whether you're doing an experiment. Then you're going to describe the data. I apologize, I forgot the R on describe the data. Describing the data could happen with pictures and whatnot. Those are things we're going to talk about in chapter 2. Then you're going to interpret the data. Those are some things we'll talk about in chapter 6 and 7. And so as we get to these, as we make our study, we're going to come back to this study we've made, and we're going to try and pull together some things. Then we're going to interpret the data, you know, figure out, is Coke better or Pepsi better, and then finally at the end we want to identify any possible errors. But hopefully in our planning we've identified those errors already, and we've tried to do things to eliminate any struggles, any possibility of errors messing things up. Okay, that's the basics. And this chapter is really about the first 2 here. We're just trying to study the first 2 so that we can move forward and go beyond that. And then the other chapters we'll do these other things. Okay. So the first step in designing a statistical study requires us to do some kind of data collection. And so we have to, once we decide on the variables that we're interested in, the population, and then we develop some sort of plan for collecting the data, we actually collect the data. And so what we have listed here are the 4 types of plans for collecting data that you can do. The first type is called an observational study. And what an observational study is where you essentially, as a researcher, you observe and record what you see. When I was in college, they did a study, the psychology department did a study of gerbils, and what they were trying to do is see if gerbil behaviors were similar to rat behaviors, and if gerbils could be used to study many different types of drugs and so forth, just like rats could be, because gerbils were actually cheaper, smaller, and would eat less or something. So there was some reason they wanted to study gerbils for that, and but they observed them over several years while I was in college. And while they were observing the gerbils, they were recording behaviors and so forth. So they could see if they would be a suitable replacement. The next kind of study is really sometimes what's called the holy grail of statistics. And what you want to do is you want to perform an experiment. And what an experiment is where you have some sort of treatment, and you take that treatment and you apply it to the experimental subjects. In case of like in education, sometimes a person will teach a class, and they'll teach one class one way, maybe the normal way they teach with lecture, and the other class they'll only teach by doing group activities. And their goal then is, based on the treatment of group activity, does that make a difference in student learning? And so the group that doesn't get the group activities is called a control group. The group that does get the group activity is called the treatment group. And everybody in both groups are called experimental units. And that's the key of an experiment. If you're doing drugs, you'll sometimes have something called a placebo, essentially a fake drug. And I'll tell you about that in class tomorrow, and what that's like, and how placebos are given and made to mimic actual real medication. The third method of data collection is a simulation. And a simulation is some sort of mathematical or physical model that actually mimics a situation or a process. And typically it mimics a random type process. And so it's like automobile companies use crash dummies. So they simulate injuries to real people by using crash dummies. It saves them money, and it helps them not to kill people, which is a good thing. All right, and then finally you can do a survey, and this is probably one of the most common ways to do it, but is in some sense not necessarily as strong statistically. But surveys basically ask questions, and then you record the responses of people. Sometimes surveys will be part of experiments or observations, but in general it's a separate kind of approach to how you might collect some data. So you need to know the difference between each of those. Read your textbook. You might want to take some notes from that as well. Okay, to finish up this video, I want to talk to you a little bit about what's coming up on the next video. The two things we've done so far are really the basics of designing a study and how do you collect data. And what we're going to talk about in the next video is going to be the actual experimental designs. Now we've touched on that a little bit by talking about the control group and the treatment group, but we want to talk about that in a little more detail. And then we also would like to talk about sampling techniques, which has quite a bit to do with simulation and also how you would set up experiments properly. So both of those are going to need a little bit of discussion, probably show you how to do some calculator stuff, and we'll do some things in class over the next day or so that will help us do that. Tomorrow's video I will talk about the vocabulary of these things, and maybe we'll get into a couple of examples to help you out. Alrighty, we'll talk to you later. Have a good evening after you watch this. Take good notes, and don't forget to look at the textbook.